All right, boys and girls, a little bit of book time with Uncle Kyle, as some of you like to say. And I'm very happy that the first time we did this, we've done this a few times, but the last time we did it, we kind of dedicated to telling you the books, how to get the books, putting links for the books. We're going to do the same thing today, but we're going to talk a little bit about Agincourt, or Azincourt, which is the correct way to spell it. I'm not sure how they said it in France, but the English one, so we're going to say Agincourt. So the way this came about, my wife suggested that I listen to Bernard Cornwell's Agincourt, and this is read by Charles Keating. So it's a fiction based on fact or historical fiction. As we're driving around the country, we decided to listen to this book. She'd already heard it. She said it was awesome. And I knew a little bit about Agincourt because I'd heard the speech from Shakespeare's Henry V, we few, we lucky few, we band of brothers. I'm probably butchering that, but you get the idea. On St. Crispin's Day is what they talked about or what Shakespeare talked about in that specific poem, the play Agincourt. As I went through this historical fiction, a lot of things became evident. First of all, I didn't know as much as I thought I knew about that battle. In this book, he goes back to Soissons in 1414 when the French were fighting the French, and they'd hired some mercenary archers and some other mercenaries. They came there, they battled back and forth, and then at the end, and we don't know how much of this is true, but in the end, they took some of those archers, they cut off their fingers, they poked out their eyes, and then to finish them off, the last thing they did was they castrated them. They bled to death in the middle of that town. That sounds pretty gruesome, and it's pretty gruesome in the book, but I highly recommend Bernard Cornwell's Agincourt. So that led me to start to dig a little bit deeper. And at the end of the book, Agincourt, Bernard Cornwell also talks about some of the other books that he read to kind of clue him in on what was happening there. So the first book that he recommended was this Juliet Barker Agincourt book. I'll just go right out of the gate and say this is an absolute stellar book. You need to listen to the fiction based on fact, the historical fiction first, my recommendation, and then pick this book up and read it. I've made a bunch of notes in this book, and what really drove the point home at this book was the lack of leadership on the French side and the abundance of good leadership on the English side. They were heavily outnumbered by the French. They had went to Harfleur, and they had put a siege on that town, eventually won that, but it made all of the soldiers from King Henry's army, Henry V's army, very weak. A lot of those guys were sick. A lot of them died or had to go back to England because of their sickness. Yet they continued. And their plan was to go to Calais, to exfil from Calais. He felt that that was some of his rightful territory from his father's rule. So that was pretty interesting. The other thing that I didn't quite understand when listening to the fiction book was some of the references that were made. I didn't get it until I read this book. And one of those references that I thought was pretty intriguing was that King Henry had a big scar on his face because he'd been shot in the face by an archer. Not one of his archers, but an enemy archer, back at the Battle of Shrewsbury when he was just a prince before he became a king. That led him to feel that he understood the necessity of having archers and how much fear archers could put in the heart of another army. So therefore, he started gathering up all of his archers for this big battle that he didn't even know was going to happen at Agincourt. The other thing that's interesting about these archers, I believe it was everybody from like 15 or 16 years old up to the age of 60, every Sunday they were supposed to practice their archery skills. Kind of like our Second Amendment rights. They didn't have guns at the time, so they were going to practice their archery skills. So if you don't know what it's like to shoot a longbow, which I've only done a couple of times, when I try to draw a longbow, I can barely get it back because I'm not an archer. I'm not a dedicated archer. And that's how these guys were. So I'd highly recommend reading this book to lead you into, or lead you from the first fictionalized Agincourt to really what happened there. And you're going to see that they are very, very closely tied. There was some heavy rain that happened at Agincourt. The French were a little bit overzealous. They put their archers behind the men-at-arms because they thought the men-at-arms were just going to go up and crush the English because they outnumbered them so heavily. And yet what happened? The archers were used correctly on the English side. The men-at-arms were ready to go, but the archers were on the flanks, and they started dropping bodkins and other arrows into the faces of those archers or those men-at-arms on the French side. So now they had to put their shields down and start marching against a prepared enemy because they had no place to run and hide. They had to march across that muddy field. The other thing that happened was the horses charged. There's big spikes put in the ground, and those horses either became impaled on those spikes or dumped their riders and then ran around the battlefield. And these were horses made for battle. They weren't scared of running people over, whether they were French or English. All right, so that's the second book I read about Agincourt by Juliet Barker. Highly recommend it. The next book that he talked about was Great Battles, Agincourt by Ann Curry. And he recommended that this book was not as good as Juliet Barker's book. I would highly recommend, if you're very, very, very into Agincourt, then read this book. If you're just reading these for enjoyment, I would skip this book. The next one, and I'm not sure if we have a link up for this one or not. I have not read this book yet, but I thought this was kind of interesting. The Master of Game. This is written by Edward, the Duke of York. Sadly, he was killed at Agincourt on the English side. One of the men-at-arms, one of the higher ranking, well, a duke, he's pretty high ranking. He was actually killed at Agincourt. But this, I just started this book, and it's a copy of a reprint of his book. Kind of interesting to hear what he has to say about hunting. He was a dedicated hunter, but was killed at Agincourt. If that wasn't deep enough hole that I dug, the last book was called Longbow by Robert Hardy. This book has a lot of illustrations that you can go through and see different ways of using the longbow. Very interesting book. Also takes a little bit of digging to get through it. This is more of a reference, and I've went through to try to figure out really what happened with those archers at Agincourt. So once again, if you're going to pick a book, pick Agincourt by Bernard Cornwell. Listen to this book. And usually, you know me, I like to read books. Listen to this book. If you listen to it, Charles Keating, I believe was his name there. Charles Keating, when he does the voices, it's just unbelievable. And then if you enjoy that book, you're going to enjoy Juliet Barker's book equally as well. Now, the last thing I want to say, we went so far down this rabbit hole, and my son is actually here filming this, so he knows about the Agincourt rabbit hole that we went down. We went to Soissons. We walked through that exact church that they talk about in Bernard Cornwell's book. We saw a femur bone from either St. Crispin or St. Crispinian. We're not sure which one, or if it's actually their femur bone, but there's also a really cool painting that's in that church as well, or cathedral, whatever you want to call it. From there we went to Waterloo, which has nothing to do with this, and then from there we went to Agincourt. We got to see the battlefield. There's really nothing there, but still the open fields of Agincourt and I guess it would be considered part of Normandy, France as well. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed this. We probably went a little bit long there, but as I always say, read. Pick up a book and read. Read about history. If you don't like history, read some fiction. I've been reading a little bit of fiction, but I always come back to wanting to read history books and learn something from the history of our country or other countries to kind of see where we come from or maybe where we're going. All right, I'm Kyle Lamb. Go check these out at Viking Tactics. These will be listed under podcasts. There'll be a drop down that says gear and book recommendations. If you click on the Agincourt book recommendations, you'll be able to see these. So if that doesn't work for you, if you don't want to go to our website to get these links, if you'll look below this video, you'll see those links as well. Now, just to be honest with you, some of these we're going to get a couple pennies with if you go to Amazon to buy them. It's the easiest way to get them is just to click on those links, but we're going to make that profit. I have to say that because I don't want to be dishonest with anybody, but it's the easiest way for me to direct you to where those books are at. Once again, check them out. Hopefully we'll see you in the library. If not in the library, we'll see you on the range.